Good afternoon. My name is Damien, the tall, friendly atheist dad. If you haven't noticed by now, I've got a podcast. So if you go to anchor.fm/TFAD pod, you get to listen to a lot of the other readings I've done and my podcast in general, where I interview people, give my own thoughts on particular topics, and present atheism from an intellectual standpoint. For today, or I should say for this episode, I'm going to read The Mystery of Acts by Richard L. Purvo. I first heard of this book from Richard Carrier when I was looking at the Jesus historicity question, and he referenced this book in his book and his talks and his works. So I've decided that I'll give a reading of it and see what it says. So get comfortable and we'll get reading. Now, this is a particularly long book, though apparently by academic standards this is quite short. So I'll read for about half an hour or so, and we'll just see where it goes. But yes, the Mystery of Acts, unravelling its story. Now, if you are listening and want to shout out, feel free to comment. The Mystery of Acts, unravelling its story. Now, I'm going to read the preface first. This is the preface of The Mystery of Acts. Let me get slightly more comfortable. And here we go. In the past 2 decades, there has been a great revival of interest in the historical Jesus. Almost all that is known about that figure comes from texts produced by his followers, whose interests were more religious than historical. The book of Acts and its companion gospel, according to Luke, are responsible for the general understanding of how the Christian church originated and spread. It is eminently logical for those who wish to examine the sources of information about the Jesus of history to look also, if not initially, at the forces and movements that gave birth to those sources. A good deal of those data are found, or are said to be found, in the book of Acts. As far as it is known, Luke was the first author who attempted to show the bridge between Jesus of Nazareth and the communities that developed a world religion that appeals to Jesus as its founder. How he achieved this goal is the primary subject of this little book. A rejected idea for a title, Acts with Tears, played upon an earlier practice of using without tears to signal to readers that the book in question would make a difficult subject accessible to the general public. The goal is eminently worthy, and I believe that some experts should view it as an obligation. Without Tears had a patronising ring, implying that the general public needs to be spoon-fed, that subjects require dumbing down if they are to command interest. There is a difference, after all, between the lucid explication of complicated issues and oversimplification for the sake of instant intelligibility. I have long thought that one sign of mastery over a particular subject is the capacity to explain it in plain language. Any failures I have exhibited in this regard may therefore be attributed to insufficient mastery. And I'll briefly pause there and just give some brief comments. Because, yeah, it does seem that whoever wrote Luke also wrote Acts. Oh, there's actually... there is a comment from Maths with Caleb. Quite frankly, you have one of the most soothing voice, I think it's supposed to be voices, but the soothing voiced I've ever heard, but I think it's supposed to be voices. So that's all. Thank you very much, Maths with Caleb. I hope you're enjoying this reading series. And I'm just going to quickly type thank you. Thank you. There we go. And this is the thing with any academic subject, is that if you want the general public to be able to understand what you're saying, then yes, you need to be able to explain what you want to say in... Maybe dumbing down is the most politically incorrect way of putting it, but I think it is a one way of saying it. Then yeah, because not everyone is an expert in the field, not everyone is an expert in historical methods, and particularly those who follow a fundamentalist form of the faith. They don't really care for nuance. So yeah, it's and yeah, like when I was a fundamentalist, I would have seen books like this and gone, oh, they're just anti-theistic, bias beyond all recognition. And yes, I would have dismissed something like this. But yes, anyway, I'm going to turn the page. Specialists utilize jargon and technical terms when communicating with one another. This is no less true of orchid growers and football fans than it is of nuclear physicists and theologians. Jargon is a useful type of shorthand. It is much easier to say ecclesiology or blitz than it is to speak repeatedly of the constitution, form, nature and doctrine of and about the church, or to state that the linebackers charge straight for the quarterback. Technical language does crop up in this book, but a definition accompanies each unfamiliar term on its first appearance. Moreover, since not everyone reads with full concentration and careful attention from beginning to end, a glossary of names, terms, and dates is appended. Instead of abundant footnotes, this book places many references within parentheses. Although this is stylistically awkward, the hope is that it will be more user-friendly. It also means that many scholars do not receive direct and immediate credit for their ideas. The lists for further reading associated with each chapter seek to compensate in part for this lack of acknowledgement. All who write and read about Luke and Acts have to deal with the potential confusion caused by the use of Luke for the implied author of both, and as the name of the first book. The solution here is to use either the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel with an uppercase G, where there might be ambiguity. Few disciplines have been more open to the charge of teaching their subject without tears than has been Christian theology, though its most numerous representatives, the clergy of local communities. Although clergy in the mainstream traditions have had to confront critical problems and have been exposed to critical methods in the course of their professional education, all too few of them share this learning in their teaching and preaching. Their reasons are pastoral, but the result is paternalism. Since many church members have encountered critical thinking in educational settings or through the media, this paternalism has become insidious. Both believers and non-believers have as much right to learn what is going on in biblical studies as they do in medicine. This book is aimed at them. Therein lies another sense of the prepositional phrase, without tears. And just a brief pause there. And I think this is a thing that Bart Ehrman also makes in his book, Jesus Interrupted, that, what pastors and priests and clergy learn in their education doesn't always make it out to the pulpit. And this is the thing, when your position and your salary rely on speaking without rebuttal on a particular topic, and people whose identity relies on the unwavering truth in what's being taught to them, then yes, all the critical stuff is not going to make it. So, yeah, I'm good to see he's picked this up here. Back to the reading. The Acts of the Apostles, as it is entitled, is a crucial book in the New Testament. Many can enjoy it, but it bristles with problems, including the problem of its portrait of the Jewish people. This book attempts ruthlessly to expose those difficulties, both because they are essential to an understanding of Christian origins, and because true appreciation of Acts requires an understanding of its difficulties, including the difficulties that its author had to manage. If some of the explanations or definitions seem a trifle too condescending, the hope is that this deceit will be overcome by the refusal to pull punches. For 30 years, Acts has been the chief focus of my research and writing in the New Testament field, and it has been through Acts that my other academic interests emerged and developed. It is my favourite book of the Christian Bible. I love it. If some may wonder how this love can be expressed by apparently smashing Acts into pieces, I should replay that laughter follows tears, and that there can be no Easter without Good Friday. And then the rest of the preface just goes on about stylistic quotations, but he does end with a thanks to Tom Hall and the staff of Polebridge Press. Richard I. Pervo, St. Paul, Minnesota, April 2008. So yeah, this is interesting, to say the least. But yes, if you have any comments or questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Anyway, so I plan to read for another, let's say, about 20 minutes or so. So anyway, this is now chapter 1. A few basics. Introducing introduction. Now the reason for that is like the chapters, even though this is apparently a short book, it is very wordy. So anyway, I'll here we go. Chapter 1. Some years ago, while sampling the wares of a used book emporium, I glanced at a recent paperback of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. This edition, evidently directed towards young readers, included an introduction explaining the background. There really had been a Great Depression in the 1930s, exacerbated by the Dust Bowl that caused many families to abandon ancestral farms and move west to seek their livelihoods. The perceived need to supply this information was a bit of a shock. Informing the public of the existence of the Depression was, for a member of the generation whose parents' lives had been shaped and scarred by their era, like announcing that the sun had arisen yesterday. Contemporary persons and works may be said to need no introduction, but the passage of time quickly cancels that claim. If appreciation of Shakespeare's 400-year-old plays requires some knowledge of the social circumstances under which he wrote, for example, that women's roles were taken by boys, creating a certain amusement when boys, playing women, dressed as boys, how much more is it that knowledge likely to be important for works that are 5 times 400 years old? Yet languor, some might suggest rigor mortis, has overtaken the once lively discipline of biblical introduction. As many who have sought to help students learn can testify, seeking to arouse interest in the standard journalistic questions, who, what, when, where, how, and why, is about as fruitful as an attempt to promote the minuet as an attractive form of contemporary social dancing. The reason for this decline in interest are too numerous to explore here. And turn the page. And it must be said that if students often find this stuff boring, the discipline itself has become rather stale. It is tempting to relegate introductory matter to an appendix, out of fear that beginning with these basics will lead readers to set the book aside. Those who write an introduction to a single biblical book must therefore pose an introductory question to themselves. Why? And just to pause there for a second, this is the thing, especially in mainline churches. The introduction is that this is the absolute truth, everything in this book absolutely happened, and don't you dare question it. Particularly in fundamentalism and King James Version onlyism. Not only is the book completely true, but this particular translation of the book is completely true, and again, don't you dare question it. And my friends over at the Church Split, who themselves are, I suppose, apostates from the IFB movement, they'll tell you about people who have been kicked out of IFB churches, particularly for things like questioning KJV onlyism. So yeah, it's interesting that the actual historical study of the Bible itself, there's not much. Also, by the time he gets to the pulpit, all the critical stuff has been filtered out, or gets challenged on a frequent basis. But anyway, let's enough of my rant. Let's continue on. One approach is to use the introduction to summarize one's views and then offer the balance of the book as justification for those opinions. This is, despite several reasonable complaints, a quite legitimate procedure. But a more artistic author will think that this is like a mystery writer telling both the reader and the detective whodunit on the first page, and then devoting the remainder of the story to showing how the detective reached the aforementioned conclusion. An objection to attempts at artistry is that those seeking to unravel the Bible's mysteries should not write one. Another quite acceptable rationale for the introduction is to alert the audience to the author's presuppositions and biases, so that concerned readers may correct for these. An even more important goal is to make clear what questions the author is trying to answer and what methods he or she will use. Too many introductions leave these matters as enigmas for readers to resolve. All the foregoing is to say that authors must decide which mysteries they will solve on the opening pages and which they will leave outstanding. What follows, then, is equivalent to information about who was killed, with what weapon or medium, and where the body was found. I propose to begin by rounding up and interrogating the usual suspects, after addressing the most basic question. Another pause quickly. I just had a chat with Archaeologian last night, though I say last night in real time, but when I release this episode, I don't know exactly when. But yeah, he's a professionally qualified archaeologist, and yeah, he was saying that, like with most academic fields, a lot of it comes down to interpretation and arguing the case and looking at the evidence in a particular way. Like when you dig something out of the ground, like it doesn't come with a serial number or a date stamp. You have to use the totality of the available evidence to build a case. And yeah, look, I like the idea that the author gives an introduction to what he's trying to say, how he's trying to say it. If your objection to good writing is that, you're telling the reader and the detective who done it, then, that's like style over substance. I'd much rather substance with a bit of easy reading than to, be caught in this stuffy hodgepodge of, I'm doing it my way, don't dare talk back kind of thing. Anyway, I'll continue. Under the heading Some Answers. What is the crime? The author of Acts committed a nearly perfect crime. Critical study of Acts suffers from the book's success. Luke, as the author of both the third Gospel and Acts, is conveniently designated, told his story so well that all rival accounts vanished but with the faintest of traces. Luke T. Johnson, no radical skeptic, puts it this way. So successful was Luke that his narrative has become the etiological or foundational myth of Gentile Christianity. The same scholar also notes that it witnesses to Luke's literary skill that for 2 millennia people thought he told the story just the way it happened, indeed had to have happened. The story of the church's beginnings need not, however, have been told at all. It might also have been told very differently. I fully agree, and furthermore, have no desire to depose the myth and replace it with another. This is again another aside here that particularly the more fundamental you go, the more you are required as an article of faith to accept that Luke wrote Luke, and Luke also wrote Acts, and Luke is the best historian ever. Then don't you dare question that either. So yeah. Anyway, I'll now go on to page 3. Myths, such as Luke's probably, function more effectively when they are not confused with simple history. Behind the last statement stands the recognition that science, which provides the dominant model for our culture, sees truth first and foremost as that which can be verified by empirical method. Yet the scientific model is in itself a sort of myth. In any case, it requires belief. The truth of a myth, like Luke's myth of Christian origins, can be quite valid, but it is of a different order from that of scientific truth. Members of faith communities will either recognize the coexistence of different orders of truth or develop bifurcated minds, in which scientific and religious truths are maintained in separate compartments that do not interact. These are important matters that require a book of their own. One object of the present enterprise is to enter the laboratory of the mythmaker and learn whether one may discover his secrets. Such a project is, of course, an exercise in literary criticism, and such studies are perfectly valid. literary studies constitute the dominant approach to the study of Luke and Acts today. This permits scholars to dispense with questions of history and focus upon the story. Readers should be aware that some who engage in literary analysis may, intentionally or not, introduce covert defences of the historical accuracy of Acts. Literary study may seek to bypass historical problems, but it does not render them irrelevant. This short book seeks to expose the problems of attempting to derive history from Acts. Where it says, pause here, where it says members of faith communities will either recognise the coexistence or develop bifurcated minds. This to me is a very oblique reference to cognitive dissonance, and is something that I briefly touched on in my podcast with Joshua Hill, Mr. Lightning 20. I forget exactly which episode it was, but he's actually has qualifications in psychology, and so he's very well aware of cognitive dissonance. And probably the other thing that comes to mind as I read this is the idea of non-overlapping magisteria, which is where like scientific truth is scientific truth and religious truth is religious truth, and never the twain shall meet. But it's it's interesting because at what point do we say, these things that I'm claiming as the best interpretation or the best explanation of reality, and by which I will judge both myself and yourself and anyone who doesn't believe what I will believe is destined for, eternal torture. It's like, well, if we're not allowed to question that, then, why? Like, why can't we apply, the best standard of critical inquiry to your beliefs? And so I think the idea of compartmentalizing is quite dangerous. Let me continue. As a narrative treating the first 3 decades of the Christian Church, Acts is unique. Canonical Christian scripture includes 4 stories of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and 21 works that are called letters, as well as another unique text, the Book of Revelation. The 4 canonical Gospels, which enclose teaching and astonishing deeds within a narrative framework, give readers a sense of what a gospel is. With regard to the canonical Gospels, one major contribution to 19th century scholarship was the development of the critical study of the historical sources that stood behind them. The assumption was that the earliest source was the most historically sound. John was viewed as the latest and historically least reliable gospel. This judgment is no longer quite so self-evident. The other 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are clearly related to one another. The effort to determine which was the earliest of the synoptic gospels, so called because one can arrange them in parallel columns, dates to at least the 4th century, and Augustine is quoted for that. Now let me turn the page. 19th century research established that Mark was the major narrative source of both Matthew and Luke, and thus the earliest. Luke and Matthew shared another source, a written collection of sayings that became known as Q. Research issued during the first 2 decades of the 20th century destroyed the hypothesis that Mark provides an historically reliable account of Jesus' public life. Although the Gospels contain things that Jesus probably said and forms of stories that he told, these texts do not allow the reconstruction of his life beyond a very broad outline, many details of which do not derive from those texts. Critical scholars are likely to posit, for example, that Jesus was probably born at Nazareth, although both Matthew and Luke state that he was born in Bethlehem. Such deductions from sources do not, to be sure, prove that those sources are historically sound. Similarly, data introduced from external sources to illuminate a text cannot be used as evidence about that text. These two tips may seem superfluous, but scholarship on Acts includes many instances of this bad procedure. Take, for example, Acts 12, 1-23, which reports a persecution led by a King Herod. A large number of critics equate this figure with Agrippa, 41-44 CE, and utilize this datum to assert the historical accuracy of Acts and to help determine its chronology. Acts, however, knows but one king named Agrippa, chapters 25-26, whom historians designate Agrippa II. Pause there briefly. The Q. I'm not convinced a Q exists. Or existed, I should say. We know it doesn't. Well, I shouldn't say I don't know it doesn't exist, but we haven't found a Q. But saying that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all derive from a Q is like saying, like how can I say, you can't argue with evidence you don't have, and and we don't have a Q. It's hypothetical, yes, but to say that this definitely did happen when we don't have that thing to base our belief or our claims on, we can't. I don't think that's intellectually rigorous. So I'm not a fan of the Q hypothesis. Yes. Anyway, back onto, so still on page 4. Another powerful arrow in the quiver of those who defend the reliability of Acts is the invocation of coincidences between what Luke reports and what also appears in the Jewish historian Josephus. From this came a deduction. If a witness can be corroborated on some points by other witnesses, that authority should also be accepted on matters that cannot be corroborated. This principle may seem sound at first glimpse, but it is nearly worthless. The fact that Ruth Harrison claims to have seen the victim, Ralph Jones, drinking coffee at an outdoor cafe at 11 a.m., and a waitress confirms her testimony, does not support Ms. Harrison's contention that she did not shoot Mr. Jones at 4:30. The case for coincidences has been exploded by the near certainty that Luke used Paul's letters, and the very strong probability that he was familiar with some of Josephus's work. This is a point also. I think it works two ways. That you can't say that because Luke got one thing right, that he also got something else right. So you can't say that, because Ms. Harrison was seen at a cafe at 11, doesn't mean she didn't shoot Mr. Jones at 4:30. You have to provide the concrete evidence that Ms. Harrison did indeed shoot Mr. Jones. And this is the thing, like we all recognise Pontius Pilate as having existed, but just because we know Pontius Pilate existed, doesn't mean that he crucified a Jewish man named Jesus. And I've seen this in reverse as well, and ironically against Richard Purvo, was that because of someone's bad character, therefore what they say is wrong. And I do use this analogy that if Hitler said 2 + 2 = 4, would that make 2 + 2 = 4 wrong? So you have to play the ball and not the man. So I'll continue on. These observations intimate that much scholarship on Acts has lacked the critical rigour that has long characterized gospel study. When Ernst Hanchen's commentary on Acts appeared in English translations, its skepticism astonished a generation of students at liberal seminaries. In the middle third of the 19th century, some German scholars, led by Ferdinand Christian Bauer, raised strong challenges to the early date and historical accuracy of Acts. Their arguments were opposed by a generation of British and German interpreters, including Theodor Zahn, William M. Ramsay, Joseph B. Lightfoot, and Adolf V. Harnack. By 1900, Acts appears to have been vindicated. With due consideration for some exaggerations and errors, as well as allowance for the limitations of its sources, Acts had apparently ridden out the storm of scathing criticism. The major but almost never stated reason for reliance upon Acts is that without it, we should have nothing else. That is, no sustained account of Christian origins. Everyone prefers that the emperor have something to wear, even if the fabric and tailoring, colour choice and ensemble fall below sartorial ideals. The following pages set out to demonstrate that although Acts is far from naked, much of its attire is, historically speaking, threadbare, poorly coordinated, and incomplete. And this again, there's a little aside. This again goes to the Bible says that I believe it. That settles it. But yeah, we can't. How can I say where it says the major but never stated reason for reliance upon Acts is that without it we've got nothing else. That's not a good reason to hang your hat on the absolute truth of a particular book. And this is the thing with apologists, is that because their idea or their identity is wedded to the belief, that they can't shake the belief without challenging their personal identity. Anyway, I might read the rest of this page because it's already 37 minutes and we're only on page 5. This is how wordy the book is. Anyway, back to the book. One cannot write the story of Christian origins by giving Acts a makeover. If the story cannot be recovered, it is better to acknowledge ignorance than to build a house upon sand. Besides, Acts is not directly interested in the story of Christian origins. Its purpose is to show the legitimacy of the Gentile mission associated with Paul. See also below under Why. It ignores much that does not fit with this purpose. Take, for example, the beginnings of the Christian movement in such places as Galilee, central to Mark, most of Syria, Alexandria, and Rome. Other facts are twisted to fit the thesis, most apparently Luke's presentation of the harmony among Peter, James, and Paul, for example, Acts 15. Luke's nearly perfect crime is not just what he neglected to mention, but his artistry in convincing readers that he has given them the big picture, when what he has painted is merely a distorted portrait of one, admittedly major, segment of the whole. Deconstruction provides no more than short-term rewards. Demolition of the edifice erected by Luke is, as stated, no more than a preliminary task. If the project of describing Christian origins can produce no more than bits, fragments, and conjectures, the result will be no better and no worse than what can be said of numerous other religions and movements. Acts is a beautiful house that readers may happily admire, but it is not a home in which the historian can responsibly live. That is the crime. Answers to specific relevant questions follow. So I'm going to finish there at the bottom of page 5. But yeah, we can see that Purvo is trying to, at least he's not trying to kill Acts as a good piece of writing, but I think he is trying to make it a product of its time and just let you know that it is, how can I put it, it is, one writing from one person who is trying to present a particular viewpoint. And yeah, should we hang our hat on everything this particular viewpoint says? Well, this is the thing. If you believe, if you believe the book is true, then yeah, you will. And if your identity is wedded to the book, then there's not much I can do to help you. But if you're willing to accept that you may have some things wrong, then you'll be able to learn. Anyway, I'm going to finish here. This is part 1 of reading The Mystery of Acts by Richard I. Purvo. Look after yourselves, have a great day, and stay safe.